We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
President John F. Kennedy made this promise to the world on September 12, 1962. On July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 was launched into space. Its mission was to land the first humans on the moon. By reaching the moon, the United States won the space race and turned the tides in the Cold War, after mostly trailing behind the Russians since the launch of Sputnik in 1957. Landing humans on the moon was the accomplishment that led the United States to be the dominant country during the time period and transformed our understanding of the planet Earth. The Apollo 11 mission embodies frontiers in history because it was the first time humans walked on a celestial body other than Earth. The lunar landing changed the political tides in the Cold War and led to new scientific discoveries. After fighting as allies in World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union's trust in one another disappeared. The U.S. did not approve of the Soviet Union's Communist Party and their leader Joseph Stalin's oppressive rule over his country. The Soviets resented the U.S. after they refused to treat the USSR as a real part of the international community for decades. The USSR was also angry about the United States' late entry into World War II, which caused a loss of tens of millions of Russians. After the war, the Soviet Union started expanding its borders into Europe. The Soviets' expansion gave the United States fear of the Soviet Union controlling the world. As a result of this, the U.S. decided to attempt to contain the Soviets' expansion. This involved a need to create and produce new weapons. A significant weapon that was developed at this time was the atomic bomb. The USSR saw this progress and started constructing their own weaponry. In 1949, the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb. As a result of this, the US introduced their hydrogen bomb. The USSR developed their own hydrogen bomb as a countermove. After testing the first hydrogen bombs in the Marshall Islands, the threat of nuclear warfare became so extreme that people built bomb shelters in their yards and practiced drills at school. As tension continued to rise between the two nations, it became obvious that space was another area of competition. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, which was Russian for traveler, from an R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile. Sputnik became the first man-made object to enter Earth's orbit, and with Sputnik, launched the space race as the United States was desperate to surpass its rival. The year after Sputnik, the United States launched its own satellite into orbit, the Explorer 1, constructed by the U.S. military and directed by scientist Wernher von Braun. Later that year, President Dwight D. Eisenhower officially formed the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, also known as NASA, which was dedicated solely to space exploration. On April 12, 1961, the Soviet Union launched Yuri Gagarin into space, making him the first human to orbit the Earth. He became an international hero. The space race intensified with Americans desperate to pull ahead. Within a month of the groundbreaking advancement from the USSR, President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress and asked for additional funding needed to send an American to the moon before the end of the 1960s. President Kennedy formally announced the plan to land on the moon in 1962 during his famous "We chose to go to the moon" speech. NASA was using 6% of the national manpower in the science and engineering fields through contracts with the private industries to try to achieve this goal. They also used an additional 1% of government laboratories. The team of astronauts chosen for the mission included Neil Armstrong as commander, Buzz Aldrin as lunar module pilot, and Michael Collins as command module pilot. After almost 7 years of national effort, On July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 and the Saturn V rocket were ready to launch out of Cape Kennedy. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins launched into orbit on the Saturn V rocket. The rocket was a heat-resistant nickel-steel alloy. The command module, which was also called Columbia, was the size of a large car and was the astronauts' main living and working quarters. The lunar module, which was also known as the Eagle, was used to descend onto the moon's surface. After 4 days of flying through space, the Saturn V rocket had reached the moon. 100 hours, 12 minutes into the flight, the Eagle undocked and separated from Columbia, leaving Michael Collins. 2 hours and 33 minutes later, the Eagle, with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin aboard, landed in the Sea of Tranquility.
The Eagle has landed.
And crossed into a new frontier of space exploration. After landing on the surface, the Eagle needed a 4-hour rest period before the first EVA. After the rest, Neil Armstrong emerged from the lunar module and stepped onto the lunar surface. This forever made Neil Armstrong the first human to ever touch the moon's surface.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
During their 21 hours on the surface of the moon, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin collected 21.6 kilograms of moon rock samples and installed a seismometer to record moonquakes. The astronauts also put up the American flag on the moon and displayed a celebratory plaque on the lunar module. After launching the lunar module off of the moon's surface and reconnecting with the command module and Michael Collins, the Apollo 11 crew headed back to Earth. On July 24, 1969, Apollo 11 returned to Earth safely and touched down in Hawaii. The astronauts were placed in quarantine for 21 days to eliminate the threat of possible life on the moon coming to Earth. After landing on the moon, the United States won the space race. The end of this competition served as a beginning to slow improvement of relations between the two nations. In 1975, the Apollo-Soyuz mission sent 3 U.S. astronauts and 2 Russian cosmonauts into space. The Apollo spacecraft docked the Soyuz shuttle, leaving the commanders of each to greet each other and shake hands. This symbolized the end of Russian and American dispute and rivalry. Lunar rocks collected during the Apollo 11 mission led scientists to believe that the moon was once part of the Earth and was launched into space after a collision with a Mars-sized object. Moon rocks also helped scientists determine the approximate age of the moon and its craters, and ultimately the age of other celestial bodies in the solar system. The Lunar Laser Ranging Retroreflector, carried on Buzz Aldrin's back, measured the distance from the Earth to the moon down to the millimeter, and led to the development of GPS technology, widely used today. Scientific advancements stemming from the lunar landing helped deepen our understanding of the Earth and our solar system. This led to the crossing of many new frontiers in space exploration. In the years following the Apollo 11 mission, there were 6 more American lunar landings. After accomplishing the goal of landing on the moon, the excitement and funding for more lunar exploration died down. In 1972, Apollo 17 was the last manned Apollo mission and ended the program. On November 16, 2022, Artemis 1 launched from the Kennedy Space Center as the first step in getting humans back to the moon after more than 53 years since Apollo 11 mission. By placing the American flag on the moon, the United States turned the Cold War in their favor and won the space race after following behind the Soviet Union. When Neil Armstrong stepped foot on the moon, the United States proved that it was the dominant country at the time. Our understanding of our planet and the solar system was completely changed because of Apollo 11. The Apollo 11 mission to the moon represents frontiers in history because it was the first time a human has stepped foot on another celestial body in all of history. The mission changed the political tides in the Cold War and led to new scientific discoveries.